welcome to the Adaptive Leader Webinar Series 2020. My name is Faustino John Lim, Vice President of the Center for Asia Leadership. Today's webinar is how to build your team's learning mindset amid uncertainty with our guest speaker, Center for Asia Leadership teaching faculty, Umar Shavurov. I am so happy to welcome over 500 registrants from over 15 countries. I did not know we had followers from Peru, so South America represent. We have the UK and 5% of Turkey and also 30% of Russia representing Europe. We have UAE, the Middle East, of course, the US, North America. And it seems that we are gaining a following in Central Asia. So thank you so much, Umar, for that. And of course, we have our close friends in Southeast Asia, where I'm located right now. I would now like to recognize our guest speaker. So joining us from Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, Umar Shavurov is the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Advisor to the UNDP, Kyrgyzstan, just recently named. He is a former consultant to the World Bank, a trainer and consultant in the Harvard framework of adaptive leadership. And of course, he is a faculty at our center. So Umar, welcome to the program.
Hi, John. Great to be here. Thank you.
How are you coping with the isolation?
Well, great. Working off the ironing board.
It looks like at least you have access to a barber. Right now, I'm just going to introduce our topic. So all around us, wherever you are and wherever you go, whether it's how we do business, how we travel, how we communicate, how we worship, even our habits and values, we have seen all of these systems undergo not only immense shock, but radical transformation. Things will just not be the same. Now, without minimizing the seriousness of the crisis we are in, the way we have to move forward in this situation is to look at the silver lining. Now, I was reading an article the other day that completely surprised me. It quoted a tech executive saying that there is not a better or more opportune time to start and build a company than during a recession. Why? Simply because that is when the status quo changes. And one of the points he was illustrating by sharing this was the critical importance that when faced with change, with challenges and uncertainty, in order to survive and ultimately to thrive, how important it is to be nimble and adaptive to those changes. So with that in mind, I would like to ask the first question to Umar. So we are living in precarious times in which the world is radically changing. It's both imperative, but extremely challenging to focus and engage in learning. So how do we build our teams and organizations' learning mindset amid this uncertainty? Umar.
Thanks, John. Forgot to unmute. Let me start by answering this question by telling a little bit about kind of how I came to realization about how the learning mindset actually happens. Early on in my career, I was always curious about, especially growing up in the post-Soviet context, with enormous challenges that we faced, how we can actually come up with better solutions to address these complex problems that are all centered around human beings. So that kind of question took me all around the world, working as fortunately with a lot of great organizations where there's a lot of learning happens, such as the World Bank and as one of the premier institutions which is charged with addressing developmental problems that our humanity faces. And that took me kind of around the world. I was fortunate to work in Latin America, in Africa. I was able to do some work in Southeast Asia, especially where now Center for Asia Leadership is based, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. And of course now based in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, and former Soviet Union. And in all of this kind of journey, I was always curious as to looking at how people diagnose problems, basically trying to make sense of what's going on, but most importantly, how they actually come up with solutions. Because learning is ultimately about not only finding out what the problem is, but also always trying to find a solution to that particular problem. And in this journey, it was crucial for me to understand that most of the time we are kind of pushing the gas, figuratively speaking, the gas pedal in a car, and at the same time pushing the brake pedal at the same time. So we're kind of stuck in the same place. And I started looking for ways how we can have a paradigm shift, start looking at how we see the problems differently, with a completely different dimension. And I stumbled over this framework, which is called Adaptive Leadership Framework, developed and nurtured in the US, the Kennedy School, which has had a tremendous impact on me. And it was super useful because it really helped me look at how people generally try to look at the problem, and most importantly, how they try to come up with different solutions with the key perspective of solving the problems. So without further ado, I want to kind of go into a little bit about the nature or the philosophical, conceptual basis of this framework. Adaptive leadership framework kind of draws its basic premise from the evolutionary biology. And we all know that we as human species, we evolve. Now, in the case of the animal kingdom, we know that generally evolution happens through advantageous mutations. Nature, by default, is kind of constantly trying to have certain changes, certain variations, kind of an experimental mode. Try to see that if this will work out better because the context is changing, be it a climate change, be it an external element, as in the case with Industrial Revolution, things are changing, and one of a sudden, you know, the usual white moth no longer is the dominant species because the birds will eat up against all the black contaminated surfaces, and only black moth is capable to survive in that new context. Now that's completely different for humans. We as humans, we have a different kind of pattern or factor for our change. Next slide, please. We learn. That is something that makes us unique and allows us to adapt and change when we're confronted with the problems. When things around us change and the context changes, we learn. The great examples in the past century of World War II, we knew that we just couldn't survive anymore with old institutions and the way outlook and approach towards each other. So we came up with great institutions such as United Nations, World Bank, and many other institutions that actually helped us as civilization progress and achieve the results that we face today, which is a better, healthier, and safer place overall, despite the COVID-19 crisis, as a matter of fact. So this is the key thing about us as humans, that we can learn how to cooperate with each other. We can learn how to predict our behavior, and we can learn to learn. And this is the key element about us as humans that makes us unique species overall in the world. Now, adaptive leadership, next slide, please. Adaptive leadership, we can skip to the next one probably straight away, is principally a framework that looks at the a set of cultural DNA, I call it, which integrates a lot of values, norms, priorities, beliefs that we have accumulated over a certain period of time, all the way from the times of the first human beings, that has been cumulatively kind of accumulated over time in our minds. Even sometimes we don't feel it, but it's already at the level of the DNA, kind of in our software. We're born coded with that. And most of that DNA is productive and useful because it helps us actually survive and make sense of this world. And most of the time, it's necessary for us to survive, get up in the morning, go to work, etc., etc. Kind of look at the weather and see that it's safe, that we can go out, or we see a thunder, we actually find a shelter. But in the changing circumstances, most of the time, there's always an element, what I call a adaptation space, is where things need to change. And coming from the perspective of today's seminar, we're talking about learning mindset, or how to engender that mindset within ourselves and our teams. It's important to start thinking about that change within the fringes, in the margins. Most of the time, changes that we're talking that are around human beings happen on the margins. And those changes are important for us to build a capacity to thrive. So learning doesn't necessarily happen for the sake of learning, but it happens to help us to survive, and most importantly, thrive in the new context. Most of the time, this, what I call cultural DNA, is 98% of the time is important, and it needs to be kept. So it's important to build on that past and not neglect it. It's important to acknowledge that and preserve the useful, essential, important stuff, but also start thinking, okay, what is the part that is unproductive, maladaptive, that needs to be changed? And in that sense, as we have probably inferred by now, we're really talking about, because we're talking about humans, because we're talking about learning, and because we're talking about our attitudes, we're really talking about how to find out what exactly is that problem. Finding out what the problem is requires that we stay experimental, that we have an experimental mindset. We clearly understand that we have a clear set of expectations, but most importantly, that it takes time. So I wanted to jump over to a bit very quickly to the next slide, please. It's important for us to identify what the problem is when we're faced with a problem, because we're constantly bombarded with a problem, and COVID-19 is a good example. So we all know that we don't have a clear enemy, and we don't know what the, probably the next slide would be a good demonstration of that, that we don't have what the clear answer is. So what you end up is that this kind of my 2-year-old scribble where the red line is all over. You really have to go around and try to find out what the situation is. Whereas the problem where the answer is clear and the problem definition itself is clear is what we call a technical problem. It's a straight line from A to B, and the red line would be a problem where much of the learning about what the problem, but most importantly the solution, and where the problem needs to actually, the learning needs to happen, is clearly unknown, and it requires much learning. So if we can jump to the next slide, that would be useful. This slide is super useful because it actually helps us understand the complexity of the nature of the challenges that we humans generally face. Unfortunately, most of the time, we end up with a situation where problems are, most of the human problems around human beings and our societies, we end up diagnosing them as technical problems, whereas they are adaptive because they require massive changes in human behavior in our values, in our norms, in our priorities. And the act of mobilizing these people, if we could jump to that slide, and the act of mobilizing these people, where the problem rests, is the act of adaptive leadership, where we're trying to change their values, where we're trying to change their norms, beliefs, and priorities. And it doesn't really matter whether you have authority or you don't have authority, but it's the act of trying to mobilize your teams, your communities, and your societies to learn how to survive in the new context. And the learning is primarily with the humans around their, what I call soft DNA, on the margins around their values, norms, priorities, and beliefs. So I'll stop here, John.
So Umar, thank you for that introduction to adaptive leadership and its connection to learning. I want to ask this next question. What are some actual examples in business or government using this approach to help their teams or their organization's learning mindset?
Thanks, John. I think that this is a great question, because adaptive leadership framework is practiced at the kind of at the metaphysical level throughout our civilization. We call it different things, right? We call it different things, but it's kind of an not a rocket science type of framework that it just came out of blue. It's been there. We just are putting it a conceptual framework and calling it a name. But what we have seen in the past is that, and I think it's really useful to give a few examples, if we can go to the next slide, that our humanity, our civilization is kind of filled with lots of examples of cases where we show that if we don't adapt, this is what happens. And we see the examples all the way to the civilization with the Easter Island, Roman Empire, Aztec, Incan Empire, etc. But also recently other civilizations where things have actually gone awry because there was a problem in diagnosing the problem, but also in changing those what I call soft DNA items. And in private sector, we also see plenty of examples in the past of where institutions, organization, companies weren't able to quickly adapt and change, again, those soft items, not necessarily technical items. Now, in the context of the current crisis, we do see, and I think it's a good segue now, slowly start going into the conversation what the crisis is that we're living through. It's important for us to kind of keep in the back of our head that right now we do have some examples, and they're in the context of COVID, where there are good examples, and of course there are bad examples. So I want to focus on the good examples because I think there are some lessons we can learn. And from the government side, we see that all the way to the case with the government of Singapore, in Southeast Asia, since we have a lot of people from that part of the world, New Zealand, which is also in that part of the world. And of course, in Europe, we see some good responses where government has been able to do few critical things. Critical things in terms of using their authority, their formal authority, in providing certain important services as they had been delegated by their constituencies, by the people who elected them to these positions. And that is primarily directing their people in the times of crisis, protecting them from external threat, and providing sense of order so that people actually stay productive and they focus on the learning. And most importantly, the fourth key ingredient, which is being a symbol which is a good symbol that we can actually look up and we can find answers. As you see in all of these three phases, we see certain trust, we see certain confidence, and we kind of are calm to a certain extent when we look at their faces, right? So these are important functions, and I will go a little bit deeper into the function of authority and how we can actually use this to help create a learning mindset, because that's really important. That is kind of the backbone architecture of the human DNA. In the private sector, we also see a few good examples, cases with, Gates Foundation, which is working around vaccines, stepping up and helping trying to find a solution that's long lasting. Google, that's kind of using its technical power to generate learning around finding solutions and technical answers, but also companies like Airbus that are working around the clock trying to find supply chain solutions and working closely with scientists and engineers on fixes, how to address, but also at the same time challenging their own institutions on how they can be different and function to find different solutions that haven't ever been imagined in the past. Now, in the times of crisis, and I think it will be good for us to go to the next slide. In the times of crisis, there are a few important ingredients, and I know there are a lot of stuff that's going on in this slide. So I'll try to explain a little bit. And John told me many times that this is just too busy, but I think that there is merit, and you can study afterwards. So let me explain what's going on kind of vertical axis. We have the kind of the thermometer of the stress level or uncertainty, when things are just not clear. And the higher we go, the higher the level of uncertainty. On the right-hand side, we do see on the vertical axis, we see that we have different stages, or the time horizon, as I call it. And I'm going to use the case of COVID-19, where we have different phases of the problem. So we had a preparatory phase when we kind of heard that this was going on, depending on where we are in the region or in the world. If we are in the Western Hemisphere, we kind of knew that things were boiling up in Asia, in China, and slowly spreading to other parts of the other countries. We kind of used that opportunity, or sometimes misused, to prepare. Then we had actual emergency, when we discovered that there was a problem, that actual cases started kind of creeping in closer to our frontiers, and we knew that, okay, it's coming in and we need to take measures. And then there's an adaptive phase, basically a phase where actually what I call a sweet spot, where the learning happens, when there is a high level or sufficient level of uncertainty and stress, which kind of acts like specific hormones at the level of society, when we start actually no longer start asking why learn. We start asking how and what and when. I think most of us are in that stage when we start asking ourselves, okay, how can we help our families? How can we help our our close ones and our companies to learn, so that we can actually get out of this together, hopefully intact, healthy, and in good standing. And this is what I call a sweet spot, a learning spot. Now, with the COVID-19, and I want to kind of now go to the red and the blue lines. The blue line is basically, as I mentioned earlier, a definition of a knowledge and expertise we have about the problem. Most of the time, and in this crisis, we realize that the problem is just, there's so much uncertainty. We don't know how the virus, initially didn't know how the virus spreads, what we need to do, whether there is a chance of relapse, etc. So the technical expertise actually went down, maybe even exponentially, as we went from different phases, from preparatory to emergency. But at the same time, we realized, and that's a red line, that as time went by, there were just too many questions, and many questions without answers generate a high level of uncertainty, a high level of stress. And it's important for us now to talk about those few good examples where the authorities, and it doesn't really matter whether you're in private sector or in government or in nonprofit, that they actually, in success stories, used their authority to kind of provide that safe space for us to learn what is essential now in this context to do in order to survive, kind of fend off the crisis. we were instructed to stay home, to look after each other. There's certain hygiene measures. So these are the things that we were required to do. But within that kind of zone, we were given space now, told that, okay, now we need to learn how to work and function in the new setting, how to make sense of the reality, how to survive without structures that we used to have, especially in the office setting, structures as in IT structures, where we had actually an IT specialist who would actually come over to our laptop and fix everything that we used to confront in the past. Now we couldn't do that. We actually have to become our own IT specialists, right? In most of the cases. So these structures suddenly disappeared, and the function of the authority, and that authority can be either you as an individual who is the head of your department, or the president, or a person who doesn't necessarily have what I call an informal authority, somebody who actually is really good at helping out other people, who comes in and steps in and actually provides some structure so that people continue learning, so they don't blow up. So, they just don't do any silly things, or they don't start doing what I call work avoidance. And I think we talked a little bit, we will talk a little bit later, where we as humans, we start, when we are confronted with adaptive problem, which requires us to learn, we generally start doing two things. We start either shifting the priority or the focus of the problem, or we start diverting trying to find somebody who we can blame, and use that as an opportunity to actually divert the attention. As a result of this, we should come out with a new mindset. And I think these government and private sector examples have been super useful in building the capacity of their people to learn. And that is the important art of the adaptive leadership. It's about building the capacity of the people who need to learn the most how to learn. Thanks.
So Umar, what I love about adaptive leadership is that it codifies things that we kind of already know, and but it's something that hasn't been perhaps defined, or it's difficult to talk about. And I also like how adaptive leadership is helping us really get to that sweet spot. So that is a good segue to question 3. What are some practical ways we can implement some of these ideas today to help build that learning mindset, to go to that sweet spot for our team and organization? And Omar, just a quick reminder, we are kind of running a bit out of time, but I know you'll do your best to be concise.
Yes, thank you, John. I think the takeaway number 1 is that we need to understand the type of the problem we're faced with. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we're actually try to apply technical fixes to vastly adaptive problems. So do your checklist. And I think this is a pretty good framework for you to kind of understand what the problem you're facing. When you're faced with an adaptive problem, I think the next slide will be a good tip for you, is to understand that you will get a pretty good sense that you're facing an adaptive challenge when you pose a problem that you think the team is not doing or not learning, is that they start doing two things, either diverting attention or displacing responsibility. And that's a good segue for you to understand, okay, this is what's really going on, and a good starting point to start a diagnosis and understanding the nature of the problem. The second takeaway is that, if we can go to the next slide, the best learning happens with a certain amount of uncertainty and stress. So use it productively, create a sense of trust, because trust is an important ingredient especially in times of uncertainty. But that trust is an ongoing business. Ongoing, what do I mean? It's not a zero sum. It takes time. And even in sometimes in cases when you lose that trust, you can actually earn it back. So think of it as an ongoing business. Second, build structures where people feel calm and protected, especially in the times of stress or crisis, when the stakes are high, when the life is at stake or economy is at stake, when the time dimension is really compressed, when we need to do things really, really fast. It's important that we create these structures to allow us to protect those who actually most need. And most importantly, we need to make sure that the voices that we generally trying to silence have an opportunity to tell us maybe a perspective that we might have missed, because these deviant voices might have an important message that will help us get out of this crisis or learn something new. The third takeaway, which is an important one, I think, is that the leadership is an art. Art in the sense that it's not, as you might have mentioned, as you might have noticed, it's not with a certain role or is with a certain office that we inherit. It's a practice that we choose to perform. So please stay curious, trying to understand what's the problem we're actually trying to solve and what is the solution to. Find partners, because it's important that you understand dealing with adaptive problems requires building community, so you don't get burnt off, but most importantly, that other people can help you in dealing with this problem. And stay experimental. Don't despair if things fall apart. Keep trying. And this is as I mentioned, this is the art. Thanks, John.
Umar, thank you so much for that presentation. We'll get right into the questions. We might go, just to signal to our viewers, we may go a couple minutes over time, but we'll do our best. And thanks in advance for your time. So we have one that has been voted up. So if you have questions, please put it in the poll, and you can upvote questions that you resonate with. So we have a question here from Ian Carlo Olegario. I believe he's from the Philippines. So how do we engage the learning mindset of some seasoned employees, especially those who are almost about to reach retirement? Some of them refuse innovation, and they refuse to engage with organization's future directions. So Umar, how would you answer Ian?
So I think that this is a great question. Engaging people with different perspectives, especially different towards in relation to you, is where the real stuff happens. And that's generally the most difficult part. Talking to like-minded people is easy. Talking to people who disagree with you, what I call deviant voices, is the most difficult part. So that's one. Second, you have to understand that what they're doing has a rationale, has a logic. It's important for you to understand what is that logic and how they're operating. And when you're doing that, it's important to keep in the back of your head that by doing what they're doing, by saying what they're saying, they're trying to solve a certain problem. So the question for you is to understand what problem are they trying to solve by holding off, or as we often call, resisting the change. Most of the time, people in more senior age demographic, they have built up their credibility in the organizations based on certain expertise, right? And that is their sense of authority. That's their sense of authority. That's what makes them who they are. And in the times of crisis, suddenly that becomes just not relevant, because you can no longer use that as basis for you to kind of order people around. And people generally realize that, okay, the knowledge that you used to hold is no longer applicable. So resistance comes from that function that now suddenly people start realizing, okay, I am now incompetent. So they don't resist the change, they fear the loss of certain things. And in this case, the loss of competence. Everybody wants to change. Even this person wants, in the senior position, wants to change. But it's that art of finding out what's really going on, finding out where this person is coming from. And then most important, the third ingredient is how do you engage this person? Engaging it from the position, okay, you're an old fool, doesn't help. It's never helpful. Engaging it from the position of empathy and trying to understand where the person is and how you can actually use this person's expertise to help solve the problem is going to be probably much more productive and helpful within your organization. John.
Okay, so we have another question from Elizabeth Jacob. She asked this. In Malaysia, we seem to have a reluctance to embrace virtual learning and also ownership towards learning by the individual. As such, in the beginning to force the learning mindset, are we able to enforce learning by making learning mandatory for employees? Will that over time help to develop the learning mindset?
That's a great question. Let me frame it correctly. Authority, where generally befalls the word enforcement, which presumes, I would imagine, the HR department or the higher ups generally come up with a curriculum because they want to upskill their labor force, has an important function. And it's important that we understand the nature of the authority that is genuinely and genuinely useful. Not everything that authority does is counterproductive. Although I think that in our human history shows that most of the time we have been betrayed by authority a lot of times in one or another way. So we have that cultural memory or historic memory where we see everything that comes from authority with certain suspicion. And we live in the times when authority is misbehaving or is not fulfilling its role. So it's really critical that we do have a careful balance of using authority in a smart way. Smart way in a sense that you balance what is essential, that you show the people, as I mentioned, those boundaries. So you kind of create those boundaries where people are given certain tools, certain expectations, but at the same time, it is ultimately that these people need to change their mindsets. You as an authority, you cannot change their mindsets. It's only them as humans, as individuals, they're the ones who can and should be able to change their values, their norms, and priorities. And that's a tough process. It takes time. But as an authority, your function is to create those kind of boundaries within that where the learning actually should happen. And in our technical language, we call it a vessel or a holding environment. And for that, you can use a lot of elements. Sense of trust, one. Sense of kind of a joint purpose that you have to achieve a certain target within your company or an organization. Let's say to preserve as many employees, or to by working maybe extra hours and learning new skills. So this would allow you to actually preserve the capital and the well-being of your company. So it's important to always kind of frame it, but also understand the nature of the authority, that it's just not a zero-sum game, that the learning actually needs to happen with these employees who actually have to change their mindset.
Okay. Thank you, Umar. Okay, this next question, I pressed prematurely that you were answering this, but the question is, how does adaptive leadership resonate with the other frameworks of situational leadership and transformational leadership? So situational is highly dependent on the current situation, whereas transformational is more reflective on a vision to achieve. How does this adaptive leadership framework that we're talking about here, how does it compare with that, with those two? And is it a combination? Just share us what the difference is.
We're all part of a big family. We're all brothers and sisters. The key takeaway from the adaptive leadership is that it's a constant process of reality testing. Okay, so it's not about having one vision and then following that one vision blindly. Albeit it could be transformational, it could be genius, but it's actually testing whether that vision actually makes sense anymore. Especially in the times of crisis like this, does that vision make sense? Do we need to kind of reevaluate what that vision is and how we should get about that? Do we have all the voices who disagree or who have a different perspective about this vision? So as you see, there are bits and elements of different frameworks that are part of a bigger family of leadership. And of course, today what we're trying to do is nearly impossible in terms of actually squeezing so many conceptual and framework elements into 45 minutes. But in a nutshell, it's about staying grounded to the reality, not being misled or kind of seduced by people who have the vision.
Okay. I'm actually going to make an executive decision on the next question. I see that a lot of the other ones that were upvoted follow some of the same themes of the ones you just answered, Omar. So I'm going to ask this. There's one question from Leng Yuan. What is the best way to build trust, especially now many are working from home and physically separate from each other? What are some practical ways we can actually do that?
I think we can we can all do it in our own unique ways. There are probably 7 billion ways of doing it. The way generally, and of course there are general few patterns. I don't want to be cheeky about it. There are a few general patterns that generally associate with building trust. It's about being transparent. It's about being transparent. It's about speaking from your heart. Most of the time, a person kind of makes sense whether the person is trustworthy or not trustworthy. Whether trust is something that we can kind of inherit and kind of keep it as a stock, or something that we can, as I mentioned, use and then kind of regain in case if we run out of trust. And it's always a question of relationship between individuals. So I would think along those lines, and trust is as I mentioned, is an ongoing business. Don't think of it as, if you have had a sour relationship with somebody in the past, you can't go back to that person and have a conversation and rebuild that trust. And especially in the dynamics between people and authority, or employees and CEOs, or citizens and leaders, or people in high offices, I think we need to reevaluate the way we see that dimension, so that we then have an opportunity to go back and have a new conversation. And I think the third important element is to look at people who are tasked with a function of direction, protection, and order in formal offices with compassion, because they are tied up. Their margins for maneuvering are actually really, really limited, especially in the times of crisis when we pay more attention as opposed to normal times. So I'll stop here, John.
Okay. Omar, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and insights. Unfortunately, we're already over time. But before we go, I'll just like to make a few quick announcements. So just so you know, we're over time by a couple minutes, but we're just bear with us just for a few more minutes. So next week, we will be partnering with the Star Online, the media partner in Malaysia, and co-presenting the Future of Leadership Live online seminar series. My colleague Samuel Kim will be featured in the seminar on the topic of leading with influence, 3 ways to achieve your objectives in uncertain times. The next week, we will be joined by learning design consultant and leadership facilitator Nupur Todi, who will be joining us from India on the topic of 3 strategies for upskilling in a post-COVID world. I'm also very pleased to remind and inform you that our in-person programs are now all available in the online space. What this means is that we offer all of our programs as online blended learning programs. These include webinars and live virtual lectures. If you're wanting to, for example, have Umar speak to your company and give a exclusive talk, like a special talk for them, or if you're interested in self-paced and group learning modules. And if you're interested in bringing this to your organization, please feel free to contact our team. As another response to the COVID-19 crisis, we are also pleased to remind you that our Center for Asia Leadership online contents are also for free for a limited time. So you can go to online.asialeadership.org to take advantage of our top courses on leadership and innovation. And then a final thing is that I would like to also make a reminder about our books, specifically the Rethinking Asia series. So do check out our latest book, Rethinking Asia 6. Umar is one of the authors. So How Leadership Can Be Taught is now available for online purchase on our website. And please do connect with us. Do connect with Umar. He has graciously provided his contact information as well as his LinkedIn and Twitter handles. Do visit us also on our center's website for more information, as well as social media handles for leadership insights, articles, and announcements. My contact information is also there in case you have any inquiries for me. So I want to thank my guest speaker again, Umar Shavurov. Thank you so much, Umar. As well as my team at the center. Before you go, please fill out the exit survey that will pop up when you leave, which will provide us with valuable feedback to continue to improve our programs moving forward. Lastly, thank you for your time today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And if you're on the other side of the world, we hope that you have a good night's rest. So thank you again so much, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.